They let me keep just the piano. My mother hid her real wishes inside the bench. I want to start with that sentence because for nearly 4 years, I believed my mother's estate had been settled fairly, if not entirely evenly, my siblings dividing our family's more obviously valuable furniture, jewelry, and property between themselves, while I quietly accepted what everyone treated as simply a sentimental consolation: our mother's old upright piano, an instrument I had genuinely loved throughout my entire childhood, but that nobody, including me at the time, believed carried any real financial significance. I want to tell you exactly how I eventually discovered how wrong that assumption actually was, because I think, if you've ever accepted the smallest, least contested piece of something significant simply to avoid additional family conflict during an already painful time, you already understand the particular, quiet shock of learning that piece was never actually as small as everyone assumed. Hello, and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the things our loved ones leave behind, and the specific, undeniable truths those objects sometimes carry, long after everyone assumed there was nothing left to discover. If any part of this story feels familiar to you, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Teresa. I am 46 years old, and 4 years ago, following my mother's death, I accepted our family piano as my own portion of her modest estate, while my siblings divided the remaining furniture, jewelry, and a small rental property between themselves, an arrangement I agreed to without significant objection, until a routine piano tuning appointment recently revealed a handwritten note my mother had carefully hidden inside the instrument's bench years before her death. I want to tell you about my mother first, and about our family's specific dynamics, because understanding this context matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. My mother, Rosalind, raised 3 children largely on her own following our parents' divorce when I was 12 years old, working as a piano teacher out of our own home for over 3 decades, a modest but steady income that allowed her to maintain our family home and provide, as best she genuinely could, for all 3 of us throughout our respective childhoods and into our early adulthood. I remember our childhood home filled almost constantly with the sound of piano lessons, students arriving throughout the afternoon and early evening hours, my mother's patient, encouraging voice carrying through our thin walls as she guided beginner after beginner through the same basic scales and simple pieces I had long since memorized simply from overhearing them so many countless times. I remember, too, the specific discipline my mother brought to this work, treating her modest home piano studio with the same professional seriousness she might have brought to any more conventional career. Understanding, I think, that this work represented not just her livelihood, but a genuine, meaningful expression of her own lifelong passion for music. I remember, specifically, a conversation from my own late teenage years when I asked my mother, somewhat idly, where she had originally acquired that particular piano, and I remember her answer striking me, even then, as slightly evasive, something about purchasing it second-hand from an estate sale decades earlier, before I was even born, delivered with a brief, quick shift of subject that I never thought much of at the time but that I now understand, with everything I've since discovered, likely reflected her own private knowledge about the instrument's genuine, unusual history, knowledge she apparently chose not to fully share with any of us until circumstances, and her own careful planning, eventually allowed it to surface naturally. I was the only one of my mother's 3 children who genuinely, consistently pursued music throughout my own childhood, spending countless afternoons at that same upright piano, first as my mother's actual student, and later, as I grew older, simply playing for my own enjoyment during the quiet hours after my siblings had already lost interest in their own brief, half-hearted piano lessons. I remember the specific texture of those solitary practice sessions, sunlight moving slowly across our living room floor as I worked through increasingly difficult pieces, my mother sometimes sitting quietly nearby with her own cup of tea, offering gentle corrections or simply listening with the specific, attentive pride I recognized, even as a child, as something different from how she listened to her other, more casual students. I remember her telling me, on several occasions throughout my teenage years, that watching me play brought her a particular joy she couldn't quite fully explain. Understanding, I think now, with considerably more clarity, that she recognized in me the same genuine, sustained devotion to music that had shaped her own entire adult life. I want to tell you about my siblings, Patrice and Owen, because understanding their own specific relationship to our family home and our mother's eventual estate matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Patrice, my older sister by 3 years, built a successful career in corporate real estate, eventually developing a genuine, sophisticated appreciation for valuable furniture and property that made her a natural, confident voice throughout our mother's estate settlement discussions. Owen, my younger brother by 2 years, worked as a financial analyst, bringing his own careful, numbers-focused perspective to these same discussions, generally deferring to Patrice's stronger opinions regarding which specific items carry genuine value worth prioritizing. I want to tell you about our mother's final illness, because understanding this period matters enormously for everything that eventually happened regarding her estate. My mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer approximately 5 years ago, a diagnosis that, given its typically advanced stage at detection, gave her doctors relatively limited options for extending her life significantly beyond the following year. I remember the specific weeks following this diagnosis, all three of us gathering more frequently at our childhood home, navigating our own individual grief alongside the practical realities of coordinating her ongoing care. I remember the specific afternoon my mother told me about her diagnosis directly, the two of us sitting at that same kitchen table where I had once done my childhood homework, her voice carrying a particular steady calm that I recognized, even in that devastating moment, as her own way of trying to protect me from the full weight of what she was actually navigating. I remember her reaching across the table for my hand, telling me she wasn't afraid for herself so much as she worried about how her 3 children might handle everything that would eventually need to be sorted through and settled once she was gone, a comment I understood, at the time, as simply ordinary parental worry, but that I now recognize, with everything I eventually discovered, as evidence of considerably more specific, deliberate concern. I lived considerably closer to our mother than either Patrice or Owen throughout this entire period, a proximity that meant I took on the majority of her day-to-day care during those final difficult months, managing her medical appointments, her medication schedule, and the countless smaller, exhausting daily tasks that genuine end-of-life caregiving requires. I remember specific weeks during this period with a particular, exhausted clarity, driving to her house nearly every day after my own work, managing her increasingly complex medication schedule, sitting with her through difficult afternoons when her pain was severe enough that simple conversation felt like more than she could manage. I remember, too, quieter moments during this same period, my mother occasionally asking me to play the piano for her during those final months, listening with her eyes closed, a specific, peaceful expression settling over her face that I have thought about often since discovering everything I eventually learned about her actual intentions regarding that same instrument. I remember one particular afternoon in her final weeks, playing a piece she had taught me decades earlier, watching her from the corner of my eye as her breathing slowed into something almost peaceful, and I remember her telling me, once I finished, that she was glad I had kept it in the family, a comment I understood at the time as simply referring to my continued practice of the specific piece itself, but that I now recognize, with everything I've since learned, as likely carrying a second, more layered meaning I couldn't have possibly understood in that moment. I want to tell you about my mother's actual passing, because understanding the immediate aftermath matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded regarding her estate. My mother passed away 4 years ago, at home, with all 3 of her children present, a peaceful passing that I remain genuinely grateful for, even now, understanding how much more difficult and traumatic her death could easily have been given the specific nature of her illness. I want to walk you through the estate settlement process that followed, because understanding exactly how our mother's belongings came to be divided matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Our mother's will, drafted years earlier with a modest local attorney, divided her overall estate equally among her 3 children in general terms, but left the specific distribution of individual personal belongings largely to our own family's discretion, a common enough arrangement for modest estates without significant, singular assets requiring more detailed specification. I want to tell you about the specific family meeting where we divided our mother's belongings, because understanding exactly how this process unfolded matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Approximately 3 weeks after the funeral, the 3 of us gathered at our childhood home to begin sorting through our mother's furniture, jewelry, and other personal belongings, along with a small rental property she had owned separately from our childhood home, a modest 2-bedroom house she had purchased years earlier as a small additional source of retirement income. I remember that specific gathering, our childhood home feeling strangely hollow without our mother's presence, sunlight falling across furniture that suddenly seemed to belong to no one in particular, waiting for the 3 of us to decide its future. I remember Patrice arriving with a small notebook, already having done some preliminary research regarding the furniture's approximate resale value, a practical, business-like approach I understood, even then, as simply her own way of managing grief through productive, concrete action rather than any particular insensitivity toward the emotional weight of what we were actually doing. I want to describe the specific dynamic of this meeting, because understanding it matters enormously for understanding exactly how I came to accept the specific arrangement I eventually did. Patrice, drawing on her own professional experience and genuine confidence regarding furniture and property value, took a naturally leading role throughout this entire process, identifying which specific pieces she believed carried the most significant value, and proposing a general framework for how everything might be fairly divided between the 3 of us. I want to tell you about the specific moment our mother's piano first came up during this division process, because understanding the exact framing used matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. When we reached the piano, sitting in the same corner of our living room where it had remained my entire childhood, Patrice mentioned, somewhat dismissively, that upright pianos like this one rarely held significant resale value, explaining that she had researched comparable instruments online and found that most similar pianos typically sold for only a few $100s, if they sold at all, given how many families were apparently trying to give away similar instruments rather than store or maintain them. I remember standing beside that piano while Patrice explained her research, running my own hand along its familiar worn keys, feeling a specific, complicated mixture of relief and quiet sadness. Relief that I would at least get to keep something so personally meaningful. Sadness at the casual, matter-of-fact way its actual significance, at least in my sister's understanding, was being reduced to a simple, disappointing dollar figure pulled from a quick internet search. I remember Owen nodding along with Patrice's assessment, adding that he'd heard similar things about most older pianos generally, that they'd become genuinely difficult to sell given changing tastes and the considerable expense involved in properly moving and maintaining them. I want to describe my own reaction to this specific characterization, because understanding my genuine acceptance of this framing matters for everything that eventually happened. I did not push back significantly against Patrice's assessment at the time. I want to be honest that my own attachment to that piano had never been primarily financial. Understanding it, throughout my entire life, as something meaningful specifically because of the countless hours I had spent playing it, rather than any monetary value it might theoretically carry. I want to tell you about the specific proposal that emerged from this discussion, because understanding exactly how our mother's estate was ultimately divided matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Given the piano's apparently minimal financial value, our family ultimately agreed that I would simply take the piano itself, understanding it as primarily a sentimental item, rather than a genuine portion of the estate's actual financial value. While Patrice and Owen divided the remaining, more conventionally valuable furniture, jewelry, and the small rental property between themselves, an arrangement everyone, including myself at the time, genuinely believed represented a reasonably fair, if imperfect, resolution given the piano's apparent lack of significant monetary worth. I want to tell you about the following 4 years, because during this period, I simply continued believing this arrangement had been entirely reasonable. Moving the piano into my own home, where it remained a genuinely cherished, if largely decorative presence, I occasionally played, but never once thought to have professionally assessed or serviced beyond basic, infrequent tuning. I want to describe the specific circumstances that eventually led to this assumption being fundamentally questioned, because this discovery emerged almost entirely by accident during a period when I had no particular reason to be investigating the piano's actual history or value at all. Approximately 3 months ago, I finally decided to have the piano professionally serviced, understanding that its sound had gradually deteriorated over the years since I'd last had it properly tuned, a routine maintenance decision entirely unconnected to any suspicion regarding its actual history or worth. I remember the specific afternoon I finally made this decision, sitting down to play a piece I'd known since childhood, and wincing at several distinctly out-of-tune notes I'd apparently grown gradually accustomed to over months of neglect, understanding, with a small, guilty pang, that I had let my own careful maintenance of this genuinely meaningful instrument slip considerably since my mother's death, my own grief and busy adult life somehow allowing this particular responsibility to quietly fall by the wayside. I want to describe the specific piano technician I hired, because his careful, thorough approach ultimately proved decisive in everything I eventually discovered. I found a technician named Mr. Aldridge, an older, meticulous craftsman with decades of experience specifically restoring and servicing vintage instruments, recommended to me by a local music shop given my piano's evident age and specific manufacturer. I remember calling several piano tuning services before eventually settling on Mr. Aldridge specifically, the local music shop's owner mentioning, almost as an aside, that he was known throughout the area for his particular expertise with older, historically significant instruments, a detail that struck me, at the time, as simply reassuring evidence of general competence rather than anything specifically relevant to my own piano's actual history. I want to tell you about the specific moment Mr. Aldridge first examined the piano closely, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. Mr. Aldridge spent considerably longer examining the piano than I had anticipated for what I understood to be a routine tuning appointment, eventually asking me detailed questions about its specific manufacturer and approximate age, questions that struck me, at the time, as simply reflecting his own genuine professional curiosity rather than anything I felt necessary to attribute particular significance to. I remember him running his hands carefully along the piano's interior soundboard, examining the specific stamps and manufacturer's marks visible only when the front panel was removed, muttering something quietly to himself that I couldn't quite make out, before finally straightening up and asking me, with a specific, careful curiosity in his voice, whether I knew the particular history of this specific piano within my own family. I told him honestly that it had belonged to my mother, who had taught piano lessons on it for over 3 decades, information he absorbed with a thoughtful nod before continuing his examination with what I now understand, looking back, was a considerably more focused attention than a simple routine tuning would typically require. I want to describe what Mr. Aldridge eventually explained, because his findings fundamentally transformed my understanding of everything my family had believed about this piano's actual value. He explained that the piano was, in fact, manufactured by a specific, historically significant maker, whose surviving instruments, particularly ones maintained in genuinely good original condition, had become considerably more valuable to serious collectors in recent years than most casual assessments, including simple online research, would typically reveal, given how specialized this particular collector's market actually is. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific detail, because it represents the first genuine crack in an assumption I had carried, entirely unquestioned, for 4 full years. I told Mr. Aldridge that my family had specifically researched the piano's value years earlier, understanding it to be worth only a few $100s at most. He explained gently but firmly that generic online research comparing typical upright piano models would likely have entirely missed this specific instrument's actual, specialized significance, given how considerably its particular manufacturer and specific historical production era differ from the more common, mass-produced pianos most casual research would typically reference. I remember him showing me several specific details on the piano's interior that distinguished it from more common instruments, a particular soundboard construction technique, a specific style of hand-carved decorative element along its interior frame. Details he explained were essentially invisible to anyone without genuine, specialized expertise in this particular category of vintage instrument. I remember feeling a strange, disorienting mixture of excitement and unease as he spoke, understanding that whatever he was describing likely meant my family's original, casual assessment had been considerably more mistaken than any of us had ever imagined possible. I want to tell you about the specific appraisal process that followed, because understanding exactly how I approached investigating this discovery further matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Mr. Aldridge recommended I have the piano formally appraised by a specialist specifically qualified to assess historically significant instruments, rather than relying on his own informal, if professionally informed, initial assessment. I remember Mr. Aldridge providing me with contact information for a specific appraiser, a woman he described as one of only a handful of genuinely qualified specialists in our entire region for this particular category of vintage instrument, explaining that her assessment would carry the kind of formal, documented credibility that would matter considerably if I ever decided to sell the piano or needed to establish its value for any other formal purpose. I remember scheduling this appointment with a strange, unsettled mixture of excitement and anxiety, understanding that whatever this specialist eventually determined would likely require me to fundamentally reconsider everything my family had assumed about this specific instrument for the preceding 4 years. I want to tell you about this formal appraisal because its findings revealed something considerably more significant than even Mr. Aldridge's initial observations had suggested. The specialist, after a thorough examination spanning several hours, confirmed that the piano was, in fact, worth approximately $45,000 to serious collectors, given its specific manufacturer, its excellent original condition, and its relatively rare surviving example status within this particular collector's market. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific figure because it represents a genuine, disorienting recalibration of everything I had believed about this instrument for the previous 4 years. I sat in my own living room, staring at this formal appraisal document, feeling a specific, complicated shock, understanding that the piano I had accepted as simply a sentimental, financially insignificant token had actually represented, this entire time, a genuinely substantial portion of our mother's estate's actual total value, considerably more, in fact, than the small rental property Patrice and Owen had divided between themselves. I remember reading through that appraisal document 3 separate times, sitting at my own kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold beside me, my eyes returning again and again to the specific figure printed near the bottom of the second page, $45,000, a number that felt, each time I read it, almost too large and too strange to genuinely absorb given everything I had believed about this instrument for the preceding 4 years. I remember calling my own husband into the room, showing him the document without saying a word, watching his own eyebrows rise as he read through the specialist's detailed explanation of the piano's specific manufacturer and rarity, both of us sitting together in a stunned, quiet disbelief that took considerable time to fully settle into anything resembling genuine understanding. I want to tell you about the specific decision I made regarding this discovery, because understanding my careful, deliberate process matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. I decided, before raising this discovery with my siblings, to have the piano moved to a secure storage facility specifically equipped for valuable instruments, understanding that its ongoing presence in my own regular living space, however cherished, no longer felt appropriately secure given its actual, newly discovered value. I remember researching several specialized storage facilities before choosing one that specifically maintained the climate controlled conditions necessary for a genuinely valuable historic instrument. Understanding that whatever I eventually decided regarding this piano's long term future, its immediate physical safety needed to be addressed before I felt comfortable proceeding with any further conversations or decisions. I remember the specific strangeness of that decision, moving something that had sat comfortably in my own living room for 4 years into a formal, secure facility, evidence, in its own small way, of exactly how significantly my understanding of this instrument had already shifted before I'd even had the chance to fully process everything else I was about to discover. I want to tell you about the specific process required to move the piano, because this process led directly to the discovery that would eventually transform this entire situation from a simple question of unequal, if unintentional, estate distribution into something considerably more significant. The moving specialists Mr. Aldridge recommended for this kind of valuable instrument explained that they needed to carefully disassemble certain portions of the piano, including its bench, to safely transport it, a process I observed closely, genuinely curious about the specific mechanics involved in moving something this large and delicate. I want to describe the specific moment they opened the piano bench's storage compartment, because it represents the actual beginning of the most significant discovery in this entire story. The moving specialist, opening the bench's hinged seat to remove some old sheet music I had forgotten, was even stored there, noticed a small sealed envelope taped carefully to the underside of the bench's storage compartment, tucked in a specific position that suggested deliberate, careful concealment rather than simple accidental placement. I remember standing in my own living room watching this specific moment unfold, the moving specialist holding up this small yellowed envelope with a slightly puzzled expression, asking whether I recognized it or wanted it set aside separately from the sheet music he was carefully organizing into a box. I remember taking the envelope from him with hands that, I noticed distantly, had already begun trembling slightly, some instinctive part of me already sensing, before I'd even opened it, that whatever it contained carried genuine, unexpected significance. I want to tell you about opening this envelope because reading its contents remains one of the most disorienting experiences of my entire adult life. Inside was a handwritten letter, unmistakably in my mother's own distinctive handwriting, along with a formal, notarized document I immediately recognized, from its specific legal language, as some kind of amendment to her original will. I want to share what my mother's handwritten letter actually said, because I have read it countless times in the months since this discovery, and its specific content carries, I think, considerable significance for understanding her actual, deliberate intentions. I remember unfolding that letter with hands that had grown considerably less steady, my mother's familiar handwriting immediately recognizable, the same distinctive slant and careful loops I remembered from countless birthday cards and notes left on our kitchen counter throughout my entire childhood, a handwriting that felt, in that specific moment, almost like hearing her voice directly again, after 4 years of only having memory to rely on. She wrote, "Teresa, if you're finally reading this, it likely means you've had this piano properly examined, something I always hoped you eventually would, though I understood it might take years given how little any of us initially understood about its actual worth. I discovered, several years before my diagnosis, that this piano was worth considerably more than any of us had ever assumed, information I deliberately chose not to share with your brother and sister. Understanding, with some difficult clarity, exactly what would likely happen if they knew its true value, before we divided everything between the three of you. I want this piano, and everything it represents, to remain genuinely, entirely yours, understanding that you were always the one who actually loved and valued it for what it was, rather than simply what it might someday be worth. I have attached a formal codicil confirming this specific bequest, notarized separately from my primary will, understanding that keeping this discovery private tucked away where only genuine, careful attention would eventually reach exactly the child who most deserved it. I want to tell you about the specific legal document included alongside this letter, because understanding its actual, formal significance matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. This notarized codicil formally amended my mother's original will, explicitly confirming that the piano, along with any determination of its actual value, was intended entirely for me, specifically excluded from any broader equal division among her 3 children. A legal document my mother had apparently prepared years before her death, working with an attorney separate from the one who had drafted her primary will. I remember examining this codicil closely, noting the specific date at the top, nearly 3 years before her actual death, and the careful formal legal language considerably different from the warmer, more personal tone of her accompanying letter. I remember the notary's own signature and seal, along with a witness signature I didn't recognize, evidence, I understood, that my mother had gone to considerable deliberate lengths to ensure this document would carry genuine, unquestionable legal weight whenever it eventually surfaced, rather than remaining simply an informal, unenforceable expression of her own private wishes. I later contacted the specific attorney's office listed on the codicil, curious whether anyone there might remember the circumstances of my mother's visit, and I spoke briefly with a paralegal who had, in fact, been working there at the time, though the attorney who originally handled the document had since retired. She told me she vaguely remembered my mother, describing her as a quiet, thoughtful woman who had specifically requested that the codicil be filed separately from her primary estate documents, along with detailed instructions about where and how it should eventually be discovered, instructions that apparently included her own specific plan to conceal it within the piano bench itself, understanding even then that whoever eventually inherited the instrument would likely need to have it professionally serviced at some point, creating exactly the kind of natural eventual discovery opportunity she was quietly counting on. I want to describe my reaction to discovering this specific legal document, because understanding my genuine, complicated emotional response matters for everything that eventually happened. I sat with these documents for a considerable time before I could fully process what they actually meant, understanding that my mother had not simply failed to recognize the piano's true value during her own lifetime, but had, in fact, discovered this value herself years before her death, and had made a specific, deliberate choice regarding exactly how to ensure it eventually reached me. Understanding, with what I recognized as genuine, careful insight into our family's specific dynamics, exactly what might happen if this information became known before our estate was formally settled. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had with Patrice and Owen, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I requested a meeting with both of them, explaining only that I had recently discovered some important information regarding our mother's estate that I needed to discuss with both of them directly, deliberately not revealing, in advance, the full extent of what I had already learned. I want to describe that meeting carefully, because the specific way it unfolded matters considerably for understanding the genuine complexity of what I eventually learned about my siblings' actual reactions. We met at my own home, and I laid out the complete documentation I had discovered, my mother's handwritten letter, the formal appraisal, confirming the piano's actual value, and the notarized codicil formally confirming her specific, deliberate bequest. I remember that meeting taking place around my own kitchen table, Patrice and Owen arriving together, both visibly curious given how deliberately vague I had remained about the actual reason for this requested conversation. I remember the specific quiet that settled over the room as they each read through my mother's letter, Patrice's hand rising slowly to cover her mouth partway through, Owen setting the appraisal document down and picking it back up again, as though rereading the specific figure might somehow change what it actually said. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned, through everything this particular discovery had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. I want to describe Patrice and Owen's reactions to this presentation, because understanding their specific, genuine responses matters for the full resolution of this entire story. Patrice's face, upon learning the piano's actual value, shifted through visible shock before settling into something closer to genuine discomfort, and she immediately asked whether this meant our mother had specifically, deliberately deceived them regarding the piano's actual worth during our original estate division. I remember her voice carrying a specific, wounded quality as she asked this question, understanding, I think, in that exact moment, the same disorienting recalibration I had experienced weeks earlier. Watching her own confident, professional assessment of the piano's value revealed as entirely, unknowingly mistaken. I remember Owen reaching over to touch her arm gently, both of them clearly working through this revelation together in real time. Their earlier confident division of our mother's more obviously valuable furniture and property, suddenly appearing, in retrospect, considerably less financially significant than either of them had ever imagined. I want to tell you about my response to this specific question, because I think it matters for understanding the broader, more complicated resolution this conversation eventually reached. I told Patrice, honestly, that I believed our mother's decision reflected careful, considered protection of a specific bequest she genuinely wanted me to receive, rather than any deliberate deception intended to harm either her or Owen. Understanding, based on her own letter's specific language, that she had made this choice out of genuine concern regarding how our family's estate discussions might have unfolded differently had this information been known from the very beginning. I want to tell you about Owen's specific reaction, because understanding his own response matters for the complete resolution of this entire story. Owen, considerably quieter than Patrice throughout most of this conversation, eventually asked whether I intended to share any portion of the piano's actual value with them, given that our original estate division had been based entirely on the shared, if ultimately incorrect, assumption that it carried minimal financial worth. I remember his voice carrying a specific, careful hesitance as he asked this question, clearly aware of how it might sound given everything I had just shared, but genuinely, I believed, more curious than entitled in how he framed it. I remember taking a long moment before responding, understanding that whatever I said next would likely shape the remaining texture of our relationship as siblings for years to come, and wanting genuinely to answer thoughtfully rather than simply reactively. I want to describe my own careful consideration of this specific question, because I think understanding my genuine, thoughtful decision-making process matters for the complete resolution of this entire story. I want to be honest that I did not immediately, reflexively reject Owen's question, simply out of any sense that the piano's value belonged exclusively to me regardless of the circumstances. I spent several days, following this initial conversation, carefully considering the actual implications of our mother's specific, documented wishes alongside my own sense of genuine fairness toward my siblings. I want to tell you about the specific decision I ultimately reached because I think understanding my reasoning matters for the complete resolution of this story. I decided to honor our mother's specific, explicit wishes exactly as she had documented them, understanding that her careful, deliberate choice to formally, legally confirm this bequest reflected genuine, considered intention rather than simple oversight, while also proposing, independently of any legal obligation, that I would set aside a modest portion of the piano's eventual sale proceeds, should I ever choose to sell it, as a genuine voluntary gesture of goodwill toward my siblings, understanding that our mother's own specific documentation, while legally decisive, didn't necessarily need to be the absolute final word regarding how we chose to navigate this situation together as a family going forward. I remember arriving at this specific decision during a long walk one evening, working through the competing considerations carefully in my own mind, understanding that our mother's documented wishes deserved genuine respect and legal weight, while also recognizing that my own relationship with Patrice and Owen mattered enough to me that I wanted to find some way to honor both her specific intentions and our family's ongoing, genuine connection to each other. I remember calling Miss Alvarez, my own attorney whom I'd consulted regarding the codicil's legal standing, to discuss how I might structure this voluntary gesture in a way that remained clearly, legally distinct from any suggestion that our mother's actual wishes required modification, understanding that I wanted my own generosity to feel like a genuine choice rather than any kind of legal concession. I want to tell you about Patrice and Owen's reaction to this proposal, because understanding their eventual response matters for the full resolution of this entire story. Both of them, after some initial consideration, genuinely appreciated this gesture, understanding that I was under no actual legal obligation to share anything given our mother's explicit notarized documentation, but that my willingness to do so reflected a genuine desire to preserve our family's relationships rather than allow this discovery to become a permanent, embittering source of division between us. I remember Patrice, in particular, becoming quietly emotional when I explained this proposal, telling me that she genuinely hadn't expected any such gesture, and that it meant more to her than the actual specific amount involved. Evidence, I think, that whatever initial discomfort or even brief resentment she'd felt upon first learning of this discovery, her genuine concern was less about the money itself and more about not wanting our family's relationships to fracture over something our mother had never intended to become a source of conflict in the first place. Owen echoed similar sentiments, adding that he respected how I had handled the entire situation, calmly and thoughtfully, rather than either hiding the discovery entirely or using it as leverage in some kind of ongoing family dispute. I remember Owen specifically mentioning, during that same conversation, that he found himself thinking about our mother's careful, deliberate planning with a particular kind of renewed respect, understanding that she had apparently anticipated exactly the kind of difficult family dynamic that might emerge around unexpected value, and had worked, years in advance, to protect against it in the gentlest, most thoughtful way she could manage. He told me he hoped, whatever we each individually inherited or eventually chose to do with our respective portions of her estate, that we could all try to honor that same careful, thoughtful spirit going forward, in how we treated each other, rather than simply in how we managed whatever material things she left behind. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several weeks removed from that difficult conversation with my siblings. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this dramatically through a hidden note and a substantial financial discovery. I feel instead something considerably more complicated, genuine grief for my mother that arrived freshly, unexpectedly, alongside genuine gratitude for her careful, deliberate foresight, and a complicated ongoing reckoning with exactly what her own words revealed about the family dynamics she had quietly observed and worried about throughout her final years. I have kept the piano in secure storage since this entire discovery, understanding that I haven't yet fully decided whether to eventually sell it or simply continue maintaining it as the genuinely cherished instrument it has always represented to me personally, regardless of its newly discovered financial significance. I find myself, some evenings, missing its physical presence in my own home, the specific sound of its keys under my fingers, understanding that whatever I ultimately decide, this discovery has permanently changed the simple, uncomplicated relationship I once had with an instrument that had always, until 3 months ago, represented pure, unqualified sentiment rather than any genuine financial consideration. I remember visiting the storage facility once, several weeks after the piano was first moved there, simply to see it again, sitting quietly among other carefully preserved valuable items in a climate-controlled room that felt, to me, considerably less warm and personal than the corner of my own living room it had occupied for 4 years. I remember touching its keys briefly, though the facility's policy didn't allow actual playing within the storage space itself, and I remember feeling a specific, complicated grief in that moment, understanding that even if I eventually decide to keep the piano permanently, its relationship to my own daily life will likely never again feel quite as simple and unguarded as it once did. I have since begun researching whether I might eventually be able to install my own proper climate control system at home, understanding that if I ultimately decide to keep the piano rather than sell it, I want to find some way to reasonably balance its physical security with the genuine, ordinary intimacy of simply having it present in my own daily life again, the way it always was before any of us understood exactly what it actually represented. My relationship with Patrice and Owen has continued, in the months since our initial conversation, gradually finding a considerably more honest footing than what we'd managed throughout the 4 years following our mother's original estate division. Patrice, in particular, has reached out several times since, asking genuine, curious questions about the piano's history and my own plans for it, questions that feel, I believe, considerably more like authentic sisterly interest than any lingering resentment regarding what I ultimately chose to do with our mother's specific bequest. I remember one particular phone call with Patrice, several weeks after our initial conversation, where she told me she had been thinking, considerably more than she'd expected to, about our mother's specific choice to hide this information rather than simply discussing it openly with all three of us at the time. She admitted that she understood, upon genuine reflection, exactly why our mother might have made this particular choice, recalling her own confident, quick assessment of the piano's value during our original estate meeting, an assessment she now recognized, with some genuine humility, as exactly the kind of overconfident dismissal our mother had apparently anticipated and specifically worked to protect against. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Sentimental value and financial value are not mutually exclusive, and the things we cherish for entirely personal, emotional reasons deserve genuine, careful assessment before their financial significance is casually dismissed by anyone, including ourselves. I nearly lost, entirely, the actual truth of what this piano represented, simply because our family's own casual, informal research never thought to seek genuinely specialized, qualified assessment. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since this discovery. The people who love us most quietly, without demanding recognition, sometimes carry a clearer understanding of family dynamics than we ourselves fully recognize while we're still living inside them. My mother observed something about our family's likely reaction to significant, unequal value that I had never fully articulated to myself, and her careful, deliberate planning reflected an understanding of our family's actual dynamics considerably more clear-eyed than any of us, myself included, would have credited her with at the time. Here is a third truth. Documentation, prepared carefully and hidden deliberately in advance of anticipated future circumstances, can preserve genuine intentions that might otherwise be lost entirely to casual, informal family assumptions made during an already difficult, emotionally overwhelming period. My mother's specific foresight in preparing and carefully concealing this codicil ensured her actual wishes eventually reached exactly the person she intended, however many years that discovery ultimately required. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require withholding generosity from others simply because the law technically permits us to do so. I chose to share a portion of this unexpected discovery with my siblings, not because I was legally required to, but because preserving our family's genuine relationships mattered considerably more to me. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully understand until sitting with my mother's letter for the first time. Sometimes the people we lose leave behind evidence of a wisdom and foresight we never fully appreciated, while they were still alive to demonstrate it directly, evidence that arrives, often, precisely when we're finally ready to receive it fully, rather than necessarily when it might have felt most immediately useful. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the things we accept without significant question, simply because contesting them feels like unnecessary additional conflict during an already painful time, deserve a second, more careful look, years later, not out of any particular suspicion, but out of genuine respect for the possibility that we, and the people who loved us, understood more than circumstances originally allowed anyone to fully recognize. That is my story. 4 years of believing a casual, informal assessment, one routine piano tuning appointment, and one carefully hidden handwritten note that finally revealed exactly what my mother had quietly, deliberately protected for me all along. I think sometimes about all those countless afternoons of my childhood spent at that same piano, my mother listening nearby with her own cup of tea, that specific attentive pride I recognized even then as something different from how she listened to her other students. I don't think at the time either of us fully understood exactly how significant that particular instrument would eventually become, in ways that had nothing to do with music at all. I think about her final months, asking me to play for her during those difficult, quiet afternoons, understanding now, with everything I eventually discovered, that she was likely also quietly, privately reassuring herself that her careful plan for this piano's future would someday reach exactly the daughter she always intended it for. I visited a piano showroom last month, simply to look, understanding I'm still not entirely certain what I'll eventually decide to do with my mother's actual piano, sitting carefully preserved in secure storage. I sat down at one of the showroom's own instruments, playing a piece I remembered from my own childhood, and I found myself, unexpectedly, crying quietly in that public showroom, understanding, in that specific moment, that whatever I eventually decide regarding the piano's own future, the actual gift my mother left me was never really about the money at all. It was about being seen, clearly and completely, by someone who loved me enough to plan, carefully and patiently, for a truth she trusted I would eventually be ready to discover. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that the things we accept as simply sentimental sometimes carry considerably more significance than anyone initially realized, I would love to hear from you. Tell me, in your own words, about a time something you nearly dismissed turned out to carry far more meaning or value than you originally understood. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.